Hey guys, so we have gotten to quite a milestone with our project, and now we want to start actually assigning courses to students and moving along with actually having a school management system. Now, one thing that we didn't do before now is add a table and the requisite structure to support adding lecturers to the courses because we have courses, we have students, and we have enrollments. Enrollments would be a student being assigned to do a course and the grade that they would get. But what we don't have is having the lecturer who would be teaching the course. We don't have a facility to manage that in our application as it stands. So this video is geared towards just adding that new module. And as you go along with your development, especially if you're doing it in an agile way, as the need arises, you may need to modify your application to fit the need. So that is the scenario that we want to highlight today. So we start by adding the lecturer table to our database, of course. So I have my default connection or school management. So they use Server Explorer or use the SQL Object Explorer. You should have the same effect. So I'm going to use my SQL Server Object Explorer, and I'm going to add a new table to my school management DB. And this will be for lecturers. So I added first name and last name to this database table. Of course, whatever it is that you want to store about a lecturer, you just want to put in this table. Maybe for your school management system, you'd want to build out a whole profile for this lecturer. So you add a profile picture, maybe their specialty, whatever it is. But for the sake of moving along, I'm just going to leave it as is, just first name, last name. That's all we need for any given lecturer, at least right now. We also have to make sure that our ID column is auto incrementing. So for ease, I can just right click here and just include that identity and identity increment column. And then we just tick identity to make sure that it's identity and make sure it's counting up by 1 each time. And once all of those changes have been made, and you would see it reflecting here in the code, so whether you wrote the code or you did it that way, that's fine. And then you can update this table. And that's successful. Now, another change we want to make is to the enrollments table, because an enrollment essentially is assigning a lecturer to a class with a student and whatever grade that lecturer would have given that student for that class. So that is how our enrollment table is set up. So we want to make sure that we modify our enrollment table to be aware that it should have another foreign key in the form of lecturer ID. So to add the foreign key constraints to the enrollments table, I'm just going to take the shortcut way and copy and paste one of the constraints that's already there and just change the information according to my needs. So I'm going to say lecturer, so ID, and then we change the table to lecturers and the ID column to ID. And I made a mistake here. So this would be ID, since that is the primary key column over here, so that we know it's lecturer ID. We have to call it lecturer ID and name it clearly so we don't have any problems. And I'm getting an error here because I don't have a comma. So add the comma, and then all those errors should disappear. So that is adding the constraint. What I need to do is add the row, or the column rather. So lecturer ID, make sure it is integer because it's a foreign key. And I am going to not allow null because it doesn't make sense to have an enrollment with a course and student and no lecturer, right? Or I can actually leave this null because you could have the students enroll into the course and we don't yet know who is going to teach it. So now that everything is okay, I have the lecturer ID column, and then I set up a constraint to say that it should apply to the lecturer ID column and reference the ID column in lecturers. And then all of that is in place. So I just click update, and that should update our database tables. Now recall that we're doing database first development, which means once we change it in the database, we have to update our model. So we have to find our entity framework model, which we would just double click here and get this diagram. And then we have a few updates that we expect. We expect that the enrollment table will be updated with a new column, and that a new table will be added to this model related to the enrollment. So I'm going to right click in the empty space and click update model from database. which will then bring up this dialog box. I can drill down into it and select specifically the tables I wish to add. And the reason for doing this would be I don't want to add migration history. If you're doing CRUD with roles and users, then fine, you can do that. But I'm not going to be doing any of those things. I'm only interested in my lecturers table. And then I click finish. Once that is done, it does a full refresh. So it refreshes the enrollment table and adds in the missing column. And it also adds in my lecturer table and shows the relationship between them. Also notice, because I allowed null, the notation here is different from the notation here. Now that I have my lecturer table added, the next step is to make the CRUD operations available. So I'm just going to go to controllers, click add new controller, and then I'm going to continue with the MVC5 controller with entity framework. I'm going to specify that I want this controller to be based on the lecturers table, which is not listed. And if you run into this problem, it's because we didn't build. So every time you make a change to the model, and I think I said that before, you always do a build. So I'm going to Control Shift and B and just do a quick build. And after a successful build, we can try that operation again. So we right click controllers, go to add new controller, continue with the entity framework based controller, find our model. So I can actually just type lecturer, and there we go. So our model is now available, and we can leave everything else as is, and we just go ahead and click add. Once that operation is complete, we will land on this controller with everything already wired up, and we've already gone through how powerful this is. We get our listing of all the lecturers, the detail per lecturer, which would be like his profile page. We get to create and edit and delete. So we know that our CRUD operations for any given lecturer is completed. What you want to do is probably add a few test lecturers so that we can continue with the enrollments. And additionally, I'm going to just adjust my layout page to make sure that I can easily get to my lecture space. So I'm just going to add another link here, Control C and V, and this will be for lecturers, so that when we click that link, we will be in that lecturer's CRUD operations space. All right. So I'm just going to quickly run and show you what that looks like, even though it should be very familiar. All right, so here is our page, and we see that our lecturers link is now added, and we can browse to it. And I added a few lecturers here: Jack Daniels, Johnny Walker, and Ray Nephew. So that's it for adding the lecturer management module to our application. And of course, the last act for this video is to check in this code so that we can make sure that we pick up where we left off should anything go wrong. So I'm just going to write a quick message, and then we just commit all and sync, committing our changes locally and on GitHub. Now for our enrollment management, we're going to repeat a lot of the steps we just went through with our lecturers portion, but then a lot more adjustments are going to be made so that we can have a nice, dynamic, and user-friendly application at the end of it. So I'm going to start off with adding a new controller and leaving it with entity framework. And this time we're going to do it for our enrollments model. So we went through and we did it for everything but enrollments. So we create that, add. All right, so for our enrollments controller, we're going to just take some time to appreciate what's going on here, because this table is going to be a bit more unique than all the other tables that we added controllers for. And because of that, there are a few more functions that are going to be here that you probably didn't see before now. So firstly, for our index page, we'll see here that we get a slightly different query, and I'm going to bring up our lecturers controller just so we can compare. For the lecturers controller, all we have to do is get all the lecturers, right? db.lecturers.toList, and we just return that. However, you would notice that we have two lines in enrollments, and we're declaring a variable called enrollments, which is running a similar query, getting the DB from the context, getting the enrollments, but then we're doing something called include. And what include does is it initiates what we call eager loading, which includes literally any related entity to this table. So in other words, if we look back at our model really quickly, we'll see that we have three relations to enrollment. And I'm just going to drag it across the screen so we can see it differently. All right, so when I rearrange this diagram, you see that the lines follow enrollment. That's because the lecturer is associated with enrollment, the student is associated with enrollment, and the course is associated with enrollment, which means if we look at an enrollment, we should be seeing data for the lecturer, the course, and the student. And so when the controller is being generated, it's taking into account all of these relationships, and it is writing the query that says that you should include data for the related course, you should include data for the related student, and you should also include data for the related lecturer. So each line of enrollment is going to have data associated with the course, the student, and the lecturer. So when we load index, we can look at that a bit more. And then if we look at create, then we'll see that it is creating some generic variable, which is in the form of what we call a view bag. And you would have seen view bag for a bit in a previous lecture, but view bag is just something that is created on the fly. And what we're assigning to it is a drop-down list, which C# or ASP.NET MVC calls a select list. And we're loading it with the list of courses. And we're associating this select list, the ID or the value should be the ID of the course. And what is to be displayed would be the title. All right, and we're doing this 3 times. So we're doing this for course ID, for student, and for lecturer. So for each relationship, we probably want to have a drop-down list that will allow us to select the value that we want to create that relationship with. And as we go along, we'll see that all it does is take all of those ID values and create an enrollment record. The same would be for edit, as we know that edit and create share a lot of the code. And at any rate, if you remove an enrollment, then you just remove an enrollment. So delete wouldn't look much different. So we can just go ahead and click start and see what our enrollment module looks like. Before we do that, of course, we'll want to add a link to our layout page so that we can get to it easily. Just going to quickly hop on over to shared and layout. And I'm just going to once again duplicate this line. In the same vein, I'm just going to take out the pages we're not using. So I'm not using about and contact. So I'm just going to remove those from the menu so we have more space for the pages that really matter. All right, so now I can just navigate and we'll check out how enrollments looks. So when our page loads, we can just click on enrollments and we'll see the list that is there so far. And I had added these directly to the database. So I went in and I said student 1 is assigned to course 1, etc., etc. So that's why you would see those things here. As you can see, the table would take some modifications because, well, grade is null, title is there, the last name of the student alone is there, and first name is there, but that's not necessarily how we want our labels to look, and that's not necessarily the data that we want to present here. If we look at create, we'll see that we get our 3 drop-down boxes. So we get our grade here, which was text. We get course ID, which gives us that drop-down list. We get the drop-down list for our students, and we get a drop-down list for only the last names of our lecturers. So we see that we need to do a bit of modification. What we're aiming for really is to re-engineer this page. So when we get back, we'll look at how we can go about modifying all of these things.